My name is Dr. Leon Laidlaw. I use they or he pronouns. I'm a new faculty member, assistant professor in the Department of Sociology, cross-listed in the Gender and Women's Studies program. And I am, as a new faculty member, very excited to get to know everybody at Brandon University. I was just awarded the Feminist Legal Studies Editor's Article of the Year 2024-2025 on my newest article, Prison Abolition for Collective Freedom, Facilitating Co-Resistance to Binary Colonial Prisons. So I'm very excited to share a little bit more about what that research is about and my ongoing endeavors. I recently got a book contract with Fernwood Publishing to publish my book coming from my doctoral research and my ongoing research into issues of two-spirit and trans imprisonment. My book is called Confined in the Binary, Abolitionist and Anti-Colonial Challenges to Canada's Trans Prison Reforms. And my book is really examining the benefits, limits, and potential harms associated with introducing a very liberal idea of trans rights within a binary colonial system of punishment. I was looking into critical policy analysis and doing supplemental interviews and legal case studies of trans people who had used the court system as a mechanism for redress within prisons. So any kind of trans legal claims that had a bearing on trans rights within prisons, I was interested in understanding. And so through my analysis, one of the interesting things that I found was trans rights affect more than the conditions of confinement. Trans rights do affect how people live their daily lives in prisons, but they go further than a menial reform, that some people call a superficial rights-based reform that really isn't breaking free of the systemic harms of this system. What I was interested in uncovering and further unpacking is how incarcerated trans people and two-spirit people are using the law in ways that fundamentally challenge the system. By which I mean there's cases of trans people who have been incarcerated who are able to articulate the violence they've experienced as a Black trans woman in a men's prison as a reason to gain access to reduced sentences. We see that as a reform that aligns with the spirit of abolition, because that is chipping away at carceral control in ways that is going to reduce the amount of suffering and the amount of time that trans people are behind bars. There's other legal cases that raise trans rights as the rationale to resist extradition. And so this case, unfortunately, wasn't successful, and this case had resulted in an Indigenous trans woman being sent to the United States to stand trial, where she desperately wanted to stay in her home territory of British Columbia. But this case is demonstrating how Indigenous trans people are using trans rights to actually reject colonial control and reject colonial authority over borders. So this is something that I'm very interested in unpacking, is how trans people are using rights in the substantive ways to challenge freedom, or to advance freedom and challenge colonial control. Trans prison policies are really, I would say, guises of gender equality. They go within a larger critique of human rights and larger critiques of liberal reforms within prisons. So there are some substantive limitations to trans rights being implemented within Canada's prison system that, a critical criminologist or a prison abolitionist would immediately understand, that these rights are frankly impossible. Human rights are frankly impossible within a prison system. But I argue that the policies themselves were created with the intention that they would be revoked. So trans prison policies, when they were introduced in Canada's federal prison system, outlined various rights that trans people have during incarceration. That's the right to be placed in prisons that match their gender identities or their housing preference. So whether they want to be in a men's or women's prison. There's heightened privacy measures in terms of urinalysis and strip searching and access to single gender washrooms and privacy in bathrooms. There's also, of course, the legal right to access gender-affirming care or health care in prisons. So trans prison policies outlined various rights that can be granted within this system. The problems that arise, though, is the fact that this policy is individualized. people have to request individual accommodations for so-called gender considerations within the prison system. So that means that universally trans rights are not implemented within the system. They have to be requested, and when they have to be requested, they can be denied. And the problem is that trans prison policies themselves put exemptions on the rights of trans people. Trans rights can be limited and denied based on constructions of health or safety issues that frankly aren't defined in the policy and then left up to the discretion of prison administration and prison actors. So what we're seeing is that trans rights are being denied through this long-standing construction of trans people as risks in prisons. And of course, this is primarily targeted at trans women, as it always has been. And we could see that within decades and decades of prior trans women's exclusion from women's spaces, in washrooms, in shelters, in women's organizing spaces. This is not a new phenomenon, and it isn't a phenomenon that has went away since trans rights have been introduced. So there's this construction of trans women as sexual threats, as predators, and this is a pure trope of trans women that is meant to be targeted and exclusionary, and it is violent. But there's also new ways that risks are being articulated through the trans prison reforms. Now trans women are also being presented or constructed as an institutional risk, I found from one of my case studies. So any risk that might be constructed is a way in which the prison system to deny trans women's applications to be placed in women's prisons, and that is the biggest source of tension right now. Trans women are constructed as larger, stronger than cis women in a way that is saying their staff, the staff of women's prisons, are now at risk if the presence of trans women could be a violent threat. But also, the institutional infrastructure of women's prisons is now being considered in the denial of trans rights. The fences in women's prisons are less high than men's prisons. So now trans women are seen as this threat to escape, a threat to public safety in a way that is suggesting that all trans women are taller, all trans women are stronger and faster than cis women in a really, really stereotypical and problematic way, in order to justify the status quo, in order to deny their rights, and in order to really maintain prisons as sites of sex-based regulation. My article was based off my doctoral research, which was a critical and decolonial analysis of trans prison policies, which is really the introduction of trans rights into the Canadian prison system. And my central thesis of this article, which was just a little tidbit of what I was doing, was offering an analysis of the histories of imprisonment and what makes binary prisons function. And so my overarching argument is that prisons have never been binary spaces. Prisons have always regulated who is and who isn't within the gender categories. So my article is suggesting that there are sexist, racist, and colonial definitions that inform the definition of woman. And so now when we're looking at the trans prison reforms, and there's increasing hostility around trans inclusion in prisons, especially around trans women in prisons, now we have evidence to suggest, well, actually prisons have always been sites of exclusion. Anti-Indigenous racism is one of the findings that I bring into my analysis to show how prisons and prison logics have always excluded Indigenous women from women's prisons through discourses of segregation and high risk. So my background is in critical criminology, and I really only came to abolition in 2017 when I started my doctoral research on the topic of incarceration. Previous, I was always aware of the limits of penal reform, some of the harms of the system as it relates to systemic oppression. And then I was pushed to think through the inherent problems of incarceration, but also thinking about what else could exist instead of incarceration and carceral logics. So I began my study on trans prison reforms in 2017, and it was through then I was coming into abolitionist thought, but I was also urged and motivated to think about how colonialism would shape my analysis. And so it's impossible to overlook or ignore the mass incarceration and mass criminalization of Indigenous people within the Canadian justice system. I began reading from and learning from Indigenous critiques of the colonial system, as well as learning about Indigenous ethics and Indigenous methods and Indigenous critiques of gender. So my research, as someone who is interested in trans justice within a very corrupt and systemically oppressive system, also is informed by Indigenous studies and Indigenous knowledges. I'm trying to weave the disciplines of critical criminology, trans studies, and Indigenous studies together in a way that is looking for shared struggles, and by understanding the shared struggles, we can find the basis for co-resistance. And when we work together in these ways, it is really finding better groundworks for abolition. So right now we're seeing a bit of a threatening aspect of the potential rollbacks of trans rights in and outside of prison systems. I'm going to point to recent activities in the United States, including Trump's recent order that was going to demand prisons roll back to a sex-based placement. So really targeting trans women, especially through the discourses, to return trans women to men's prisons in a way that is completely a violent attack on trans people, but within a broader cultural context that is really threatening the lives of trans identities, trans people, trans bodies. Thinking about that in the context of this as a global attack within the West on trans rights. Luckily in the United States, that order was blocked by the courts. However, we're seeing similar things happening, and what is really to be placed in that broader context. My research is responding to a lot of the critics regarding trans rights, and especially the ways in which transphobia is particularly attacking trans people in prisons. So my research is responding to a lot of the organizing that has happened in Canada since the introduction of trans prison reforms in the federal prison system in 2017, but previously in Ontario and British Columbia's provincial systems in 2015, there's been organized attacks by anti-trans groups, some of them who call themselves abolitionists, some of them who call themselves feminist groups, but don't see trans women as women, and don't see trans rights as a feminist prison abolitionist issue. So my research is really responding to those claims, which are oftentimes based in stereotypes of trans women, and really responding to that and suggesting that we actually need to find ways to work together. We need to, first of all, demystify these pathologizing and predatory tropes about trans women that are frankly just untrue, and offering the evidence about that, but also giving the rationale why trans inclusion is absolutely a feminist issue, is an issue of prison abolitionists. The most obvious issue with pursuing trans inclusion within Canada's prison system is the fact that these are still binary prisons. So trans inclusion is frankly impossible within the system that's already been structured according to the gender binary. So my research, of course, is pointing out the impossibilities of protecting, accommodating trans people in this system. So there's a guise of equality that's coming in that we're really critiquing, but not to suggest that these policies aren't important. They are still important, less trans people needlessly suffer. So there's some aspects of rights that are being accommodated. But the second thing my research is doing is also calling attention to the colonialism of prisons themselves as tools of settler colonialism that erase Indigenous sovereignties over law and justice, but also the colonialism of gender that structures the binary prison system in a way that Indigenous, trans, and Two-Spirit people are calling attention to. And so what my research is really interested in continuing to understand is how Indigenous, trans, and Two-Spirit people are now calling attention to the colonialism and the colonization that occurs through this binary prison system in a way that's potentially challenging trans prison policies to be further attentive, to inform trans prison policies to attend to the intersection of trans rights and Indigenous rights in prisons. And so what I'm really interested in is how Indigenous, trans, and Two-Spirit people are challenging their rights before the courts as Indigenous people and as trans people in ways that have potential to expand these policies, but also to expose the colonization of the system and I really see this within the legacy of Indigenous grassroots organizing within prisons that has always been about finding cultural connection, spiritual connection within an inherently oppressive and colonial system. So it's a way of finding resurgence, even if these rights aren't, the solution, even if we're still trapped within a colonial system, within a binary regulated institution. There is organizing that is happening within the prisons that I find very interesting. Indigenous rights have been institutionalized within Canada's federal prison system in the 80s and in the 90s. And there have been many critiques about the institutionalization of Indigenous rights. Some people call this the indigenization of federal prisons. And trans-prison policies are only somewhat recognizing of that. The very vague statement that Two-Spirit people might have access to elders. This isn't a new right, but it's simply understood in relation to Indigenous perspectives and ways of being gender diverse. But the policy is really falling short of anything else in relation to Indigenous rights, and especially in how they conceptualize gender within a Western framework. Gender in the policy is embedded in Western logics that are incomprehensible within Indigenous worldviews and Indigenous knowledge systems, where Indigenous people are now arguing before the courts that these policies don't apply to them. These policies don't account for spirituality, don't fully count for land-based knowledges, and the ways in which knowledge is relational. And so people now are saying that we need further access to elders because this is how you're learning about what even Two-Spirit means that a simple policy and recognition cannot provide. My broader approach to trans rights is informed by abolition, and it is informed by anti-colonial principles. And I found just in community spaces, but also in the academic literature within trans studies, that there are a lot of abolitionists. Trans people, queer communities have really turned to abolition. And this is something that is also historically grounded. When we look at the history of queer resistance and the history of trans resistance in North America, we see that in the legacies of trans people resisting criminalization and the discriminatory laws, trans people protesting against prisons and the incarceration of political leaders in the United States. Trans people were really interested in dismantling the controls, dismantling the tools of oppression that were, mutually oppressive sites. Now we're still seeing that within trans legacies, trans communities still adopting an abolitionist stance. There is also interest within trans studies and trans activism to attend to colonialism and the colonization of gender. And we see that sometimes in a representational level where Two-Spirit or 2S is added to the LGBTQS acronym. So it's 2S LGBTQIA. And we're seeing that as a form of recognition of the way in which colonialism, first of all, shapes all of our lives and structures our lives, but also the colonization of gender and sexuality of Indigenous nations on Turtle Island. But unfortunately, I feel like that is where activism and solidarity with Indigenous people stops. And so what my research is really aiming to do is understand how trans rights can be put forward in ways that align better with Indigenous sovereignty movements. So in other words, I'm really looking at settler solidarity with Indigenous people through trans studies. And so that's something that I do throughout my work as well, in the spirit of trying to forge connections, feminist connections, trans connections, and Indigenous connections within Canada's binary colonial prison system in order to establish the groundwork for co-resistance, for us all to work together. I find that involvement in community spaces is both a practice of good relationality, but is also a method of knowledge production through resistance. So I joined community spaces because I was very much interested in practicing that solidarity with incarcerated people's struggles, but also settler and Indigenous solidarity that we all have a stake in. I was a captain of the Mama Bear Clan for several years, and I was very lucky to be welcomed into that space, and I took that role very seriously because I was working with a lot of people I deeply admired and was learning in a different way than what academia can teach us. On patrols, we would go out every week and provide food to community members. We would see the same community members and we would get to know them and they would trust us. The children in the community would trust us as a site of safety if they needed something, if they didn't know where their parents were, if they lost their shoes. We also did harm reduction, giving out harm reduction kits, but also keeping the streets clean of sharps. And so there was so much practical skills we were learning through that, but it was really embodying that ethics of care that we as abolitionists and also we learning from Indigenous knowledges and Indigenous ethics can learn to practice in our daily relationships. I was also involved in abolitionist organizing in Winnipeg with folks that I deeply admire and I've really learned from as well. I did an educational role with the Winnipeg Police Cause Harm, where I would use some of the knowledges that I had learned in academia to, write blogs to make knowledge publicly accessible. But also this offered me the opportunity to do knowledge production in a community and collaborative setting. And so one of the projects that I was interested in doing was visiting the Manitoba Gay and Lesbian Archives at the University of Manitoba. And from that, I was able to uncover some of the queer histories of resistance to policing in Winnipeg that ended up being in a blog. Some of the work, the solidarity work we were doing as abolitionists with Indigenous justice struggles in Winnipeg was supporting the landfill search. And that was something I was also able to write about in my role with Winnipeg Police Cause Harm. Why abolitionists should support this landfill search and Indigenous calls for justice within the settler system. I am so excited to be able to teach in my area of expertise at Brandon University. I think that this position in sociology and gender and women's studies is a really great fit for me to be able to share my research within the classroom. So I'm teaching Prison Abolition right now. That's a sociology course cross-listed in the Gender and Women's Studies department. It's a third-year course and I have a really great group of students right now. I designed this to really reflect my own learnings of prison abolition and my own influences. I've reflected the course material to be an intersectional and decolonial analysis of prisons, the limits of prison reform, and really prompting students, inviting students to think through what a world without prisons would be, and really seeing that as a practically possible endeavor instead of some infeasible idealist journey that abolitionists is, accused of being. It's a good opportunity to doing a lot of the unlearning from criminology and really thinking about how we can mobilize this ethics of care within our studies of justice. My course is embedded in Black feminist analysis and critiques of prisons. That was the root and the legacy of abolitionists in North America. My course is also informed by Indigenous critiques of the colonial justice system. And finally, my course is informed by queer and trans analysis of the penal system. And in fact, I'm able to teach my own article, Prison Abolition for Collective Freedom, in this class as well. Going forward, I'm teaching trans criminology in the sociology department as well, and that's something I started designing 5 years ago as a sessional instructor during my PhD at Carleton University, and now I'm so lucky to be able to teach it here, to update it, and to find new relevant cases for the students to analyze. One of the things that I wanted to bring to students was a practical skill associated with legal studies. So my expertise is also in legal case studies. So I wanted to build assignments that enable students to learn what a legal method would look like. So I'm having students search for legal cases on legal databases, learn to read the law and understand legal decisions, and also to think critically of legal decisions in order to offer their own analysis of trans people's legal claims in Canada that's really based on what their perception of justice is. I've had many lawyers who are working with trans clients, incarcerated trans clients, reach out to me. I am so happy to be able to connect with these legal counsel because they are the ones who are going before the courts to argue for the scope of trans rights in prisons. They're the ones at the forefront who are determining before the courts whether these reforms are going to be pursued. So I'm happy to be able to work with legal counsel, as someone who comments on their legal cases, who can provide recommendations or not, or even just be able to chat through the potential harms associated with these legal cases. My research is really aimed at providing the solid, concrete evidence to further instill trans rights within Canada's prison system. I, as an abolitionist, have been cautious about how much we should be reforming these systems, knowing the legacy of reforms, the legacy of the harms associated with reforms that lead to prison expansion. I am very aware of the limits of liberal reforms and the potential harms that can be enacted if the system co-opts these really benevolent reforms. But at the same time, less trans people needlessly suffer while incarcerated. We absolutely need to introduce and implement these reforms on a more broad scale without exemptions based on health and safety. Unilaterally, trans people need to have rights in prisons. At the same time, I would like to see more trans people using these rights to challenge the system in a way that is actually advocating for alternatives to incarceration, advocating for the reduced sentences, and finding ways to chip away at the prison system. My hope really is that trans people wouldn't be incarcerated, because incarceration is not safe for anybody. But if we can find ways to introduce these rights while working together to find solutions outside of the system to prevent incarceration, that is really what I hope will be introduced.